I believe and I argue that we are all now caught up quite literally in a war which is being waged against us for the purposes of biodigital totalitarian enslavement. But the point is that there is this power structure that I refer to as the transnational deep state. It's a real existing entity. It's a very useful analytical category for understanding what's taking place in the world. And it is arrayed against humanity right now and is coordinating the Omni War against humanity. Historically, I have seen myself as a man of the left. However, I think since 2020, these traditional left-right distinctions have ceased to be particularly helpful. So I found in 2020 that a lot of the people talking most sense, to my great surprise, were actually right-wing commentators.
I'm honored today, September 4th, 2024, to have on Professor David Hughes. And he's going to self-introduce. Very interesting man. He's got a few books out, and we'll go into those a little bit. He's got a symposium coming out on Omni War, which has a foreboding title, and maybe he'll discuss that as well. David.
Yeah, thanks very much, Randy. So until 4 days ago, I was in full-time continuous academic employment, but those years are now behind me. I've left academia essentially because I don't think that an academic career is compatible with asking critical questions about deep structural events and fundamentally challenging the power structures that control our society. So I have recently authored 2 books. The first came out in April with Paul Grave Macmillan, COVID-19, Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. And the second came out in June with Skyhorse, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. The COVID book was volume 1 of 2. I'm in the process of trying to write volume 2 at the moment. And I have a few months ago started a Substack, dhughes.substack.com, where you can find all of my outputs since 2020.
Fabulous. I was going to try to put them up, but I'll put them up later in the hour.
Yeah.
So you left academia. Academia, did it leave you? Sometimes it's kind of a mutual agreement. I had Nathan Cockness on not too long ago, about 2 or 3 months ago. I don't know if you're familiar with his case.
No, I don't know.
He was not quite professor, he's younger guy, but at I think it was one of those Oxfords, I think it's Cambridge, and they didn't like things he was saying outside of his job role, and so even though I suppose universities present themselves as a place of free inquiry, there are limits. Did that happen with or towards you at all? I mean, you don't have to delve into it if you don't care to.
No, Ursula Eddington has written some interesting material about how this works in academia. And some of the mechanisms are quite subtle, actually, and quite insidious. But one of the ways in which it starts is through a form of intellectual ostracization. So before 2020, I was, for example, being routinely accepted onto the major conferences on the international circuit, no problem. Since 2020, every single application of mine to attend these conferences was rejected. Why? Because of the nature of the subject matter that I was proposing to address. For example, challenging some of the narratives that we were being fed. So in a sense, you can kind of gauge the temperature, so to speak. And it's very, very interesting. But also back in 2020, I published an article about 9/11 in a mainstream peer-reviewed journal, which attracted the hostility of dozens of academics over Twitter. Very unprofessional behavior. They were all, actually quite abusive towards me over Twitter. The point is, I was just asking in that article, why is it that academia doesn't look at the evidence regarding the events of 9/11? Simple question. Lots of evidence there, hard empirical evidence, really important that we understand exactly what took place on that day. And essentially, academia refuses to look at it. And what's interesting is that tens of thousands of people have read that article now. It's been behind a paywall for all this time, so I'm assuming it's mostly academics and university libraries that are responsible for this readership. But virtually no engagement at all from the academic community over 4.5 years. So what this tells me is that there are certain taboo topics which academia will not touch, and that the socialization, if you like, that's involved in becoming an academic, where so much is about chasing money, essentially, research grants and writing the kind of material which will please the prevailing power structures, renders it almost impossible to ask the really big and really important questions about how power actually operates in the world today. So I've come to understand all of this. I'm going to write a series about it on my Substack. But the point is, the situation in the world today is so grave and so serious that I'm not willing to spend any longer playing these games, trying to kind of reconcile, this kind of genuine truth-seeking inquiry with, whatever's necessary to sustain an academic career. At this stage, we all have to do what's necessary to challenge the tyranny, which is coming down the tracks pretty hard.
Yeah. Let me just ask you kind of in context. I think it was even Cowgirls Get the Blues by Tom Robbins or Tim Robbins, I think Tom. And there's a kind of a refrain. The situation is desperate as usual. They're always turning on the news, and the news every single time throughout the book, it's a trope, is the situation is desperate as usual. So given the situation is desperate currently, probably as usual, when in the course of human nature, mankind, has the situation not been desperate? Is there a kind of a David Hughes perfect moment when things were working and people didn't kind of group and band for one means or another, kind of against, say, the greater public will, if there was one?
No, because that would be a romanticization of the past. But what I would say is that it is demonstrable that since 2020, things have become a great deal worse than they were. And that is because of what I have called the Omni War, which is now being waged against humanity. And I don't mean that as a metaphor or a euphemism. I believe and I argue that we are all now caught up quite literally in a war which is being waged against us for the purposes of biodigital totalitarian enslavement. This is a military operation which is underway. It's been planned for quite some time, and I think people need to realize this. So thank you for mentioning the Omni War Symposium coming up on the 21st of September, which I'll be doing with Patrick Wood, Catherine Austin Fitz, Dan Brody and Lissa Johnson. And we're going to explain in some detail what we think is really going on here. And the so-called pandemic was not really a healthcare crisis. It was a psychological warfare operation that was initiating this longer war for technocracy, as I argue in the book.
Well, I'd like to kind of hear you dilate on that a little bit, but just a question comes to mind. So this is like the Turing machine, kind of the it's not an automobile when you go on vacation, but Alan Turing. The question is whether you could see whether there's a human influence behind a kind of a response to given questions. And I think of that. I'm not sure I'm doing it accurately or in the right vein, but nonetheless, I think of this type of instance when people say, how many years does it take to get a degree in French literature? 4 years. How about if you want to become, I don't know, an author? 4 years. What about if you want to do engineering? 4 years. What if you want to do medical school? You need 4 years. The answer is always 4 years. It's almost like that's programmed. And so college obviously doesn't conform to your, it's not tailored to one's needs. You know, the answer is always here in the United States, 4 years. No matter what it is you want to do, engineering, barista, so forth, you're always going to have 4 years, philosophy, and so forth. Similarly, the answer to a lot of the great questions of our time, you know, global warming, what do we have to do? Pay more taxes. What do we need to do? More government control. It seems that the same way the 4 years is always the answer from universities, the answer from a lot of the I guess ideas that get pulled up, you know, flags that get put up the flagpole, to which we're supposed to salute. The answer is always, you know, less of you, more of us, more government control. I'm wondering whether you find that thematically as part of the war, and when you say it's literally a war, who are the soldiers and who are the combatants, and where are the, you know, the casualties?
Right. So we are all combatants, knowingly or not, in this war. It's being waged against us by a numerically minuscule transnational ruling class that nevertheless owns the means of production. So, for example, controls the money supply, the media, the military weapons, and so on, and is now using everything, all means at its disposal in a bid to destroy liberal democracy and move the entire world onto a novel form of totalitarianism, which Patrick Wood has called technocracy. So this involves digital and biodigital means of essentially monitoring everyone and everything. So one example would be smart cities, in which everything, all devices communicate with one another. Another example would be central bank digital currencies, in which your money isn't really your own anymore. The central bank can intervene directly to impose conditions on how you spend the money or whether you can spend the money at all. And more terrifyingly, as I and two co-authors, Dan Brody and Lissa Johnson, have looked at in our 4-part series on transhumanism, the Internet of Bodies and the Internet of bio-nano things promises to connect human bodies to an external control network. So this is quite terrifying material, because what it promises is the ability for a tiny ruling class, through what I call the transnational deep state, to actually achieve total social control over the rest of humanity, if this system can be fashioned. And I believe that that's what they're trying to do now. So that's the war. The aim of the war is technocracy. Now the war looks nothing like any war that we have seen in the past. It is effectively a world war because it's being waged against humanity. I refer to it as World War III, but World War III looks nothing like World War II, just as World War II looked nothing like World War I. So, as I'll explain in the Omni War symposium, the aims, the methods, the strategies, the tactics, the weapons are all different. And the Omni War is waged across every domain of human life, but clandestinely as far as possible, so that the public doesn't recognize it as such. So we might think, for example, about cognitive warfare, psychological warfare, weaponization of the food and water supplies, environmental degradation, punishing rates of inflation, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, all of this, I believe, is being done to demoralize and debilitate and disorientate and confuse the population, so that it doesn't realize what's happening and is unable to resist what is happening. But this is fundamentally a totalitarian power play.
So the ex-UN ambassador, the late Jeane Kirkpatrick, dilated on the difference between totalitarian and authoritarian. Perhaps for our audience, you could tell us what you mean by totalitarian, and secondly, I guess, who are the kind of international deep state actors? The term, I think, I'm not sure where deep state originated, but I thought it was, kind of a United States term for the agencies and institutions who like to get paid independent of who's, quote unquote, running the show. Eric Weinstein recently talked about the two concepts of democracy. One is, the will of the people, say in kind of, the Greek concept of, people voting on something. Obviously, you have to be citizens and so forth. And the other one is, democracy, I think, espoused by the left, which inimically, used to be of the right, which is, the continuation of the institutions, independent of how the people happen to vote. So you have kind of like the continuation of the trappings of the, some original democratic impetus, but it's no longer fully democratic. If we can make this question even deeper and laden, what is the resistance, and are there other wars transpiring which might be of greater import? For instance, kind of global jihad.
Wow, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, I apologize.
That's okay. The concept of the transnational deep state, I would advise viewers and listeners to read my book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, where I explain in some detail what this is and what the historical origins are. Essentially, we are dealing with a power structure which seeks, as far as possible, to remain invisible, but which is fundamentally, there it is, thank you very much, is fundamentally the most powerful entity in world affairs today. So we live with the illusion that we live in a democracy in any meaningful sense. I think democracy has been progressively hollowed out since 9/11 at least. And what you find with deep state power structures is that they generally allow politics to go along as normal when it suits, but every now and again it reveals its hand through what Peter Dale Scott calls deep structural events. So we might be looking at the JFK assassination, for example, or 9/11, or the COVID lockdowns, where all of a sudden something quite extraordinary and out of the ordinary occurs. Its provenance is typically very difficult to ascertain, but nevertheless, what we do know is that the course of history changes quite profoundly thereafter. So in terms of the kinds of actors and institutions that are involved in this, I think quite a helpful diagram comes from Ian Davis, a British author. And if you use your search engine of choice to search for Ian Davis and global public-private partnership, he produced a very useful diagram showing the way in which power is distributed globally in the 21st century. And what you find is that nation states are actually quite low down on the pyramid. They are mere implementers of policies which are formulated much higher up. So we might be thinking about think tanks like the Club of Rome, for example, or Council for Foreign Relations. Obviously, there are international organizations like the UN and the WHO factor into this. Central banks are very, very important, of course, with the Bank of International Settlements at the top. The major philanthropic foundations, such as the Rockefeller Foundation or the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. There's a vast network now of actors which act more or less in unison. They've become increasingly coordinated since 1968, at least, if you think about the Trilateral Commission and the World Economic Forum originating in the early 1970s, essentially to promote and coordinate the interests of transnational capital. So clearly, when you look at, for example, meetings like the Bilderberg Group or like Davos, there's a lot that takes place behind the scenes, very secretive. The public doesn't get to find out what's really being, thank you very much. There's the Ian Davis diagram. The public doesn't get to find out what's really said behind the scenes at those meetings. But it's very, very clear that there is a global conspiracy taking place there. So some of the actors are quite obvious and are not necessarily hidden. If you think about, I don't know, Klaus Schwab or Bill Gates and these kind of figures. Other actors will be less well known, and some might be not known at all. But the point is that there is this power structure that I refer to as the transnational deep state. It's a real existing entity. It's a very useful analytical category for understanding what's taking place in the world. And it is a raid against humanity right now, and is coordinating the Omni War against humanity. So in terms of resistance, it starts with each and every one of us, because we're all engaged in this war, like it or not. And I think that it starts fundamentally with the role of conscience and also awareness. There's great evil has been spreading throughout the world, particularly since 2020, as all of this has been unfolding. The coerced injection of populations, putting children in masks and much else besides. There's an awful lot wrong. Politics has been badly corrupted. The professions have all failed in their various ways. Everybody at some deep level must know that there's something very, very wrong at the moment. And so if you're honest with yourself and you look inside yourself, you have to start asking critical questions about what's really taking place in the world. And once you start to do that, and once you start to develop an understanding of what's really going on, then it creates a moral imperative and obligation upon each and every one of us to take action to do something about this. Now, I don't have a magic bullet in terms of how to stop this and how we can win the war. But what I do know is there are 8 billion of us, and maybe tens of thousands, I don't know, relatively very few of them. So we certainly have the numbers on our side. So we do need to spread awareness. We need to spread information regarding these events and these actors as far as possible. And if each and every one of us does whatever is within our individual gift to try and, in a sense, it's like taking up arms in the war, whatever it is that we can do. Some people may be good at monkey wrenching some of the technologies. Some people may be good at organizing protests. Some people run podcasts. I write books and articles and so on. Whatever it is, we can all do something. And collectively, I think we can put down this global technocratic coup.
Yeah. I was trying to think what I do.
You're doing it right now, running a podcast.
This conversation. I have the sense that you and I are not kind of politically on the same side historically, but I think we both see some of the same things playing out. I might call that kind of RFK Jr. syndrome. Is it that I'm coming around to? I mean, I my intuition is that that you're kind of a man of the left. I'm, say, more conservative, man of the right. But let's call it RFK syndrome, where you notice something that's going on and you have to kind of shed some of your. Well, I don't know. You tell me. First of all, whether my inference is correct. Second of all, can people come together on this topic? And then, lastly, who are the vehicles aside from the podcasters and whatnot? Who do you think is the main? If we had to make the same chart of, what we'll call it the resistance, how does that happen? Is there a chart? Is it much more amorphous and kind of like not herding, but herding cats? Is there something organization, or is it just kind of by natural inclination? People want liberty, or do they? Anyway, that's kind of my multi-phase questions.
Yeah, good questions. So yeah, you're correct that historically I have seen myself as a man of the left. However, I think since 2020, these traditional left-right distinctions have ceased to be particularly helpful. So I found in 2020 that I lost a lot of respect for left-wing commentators whom I had previously admired. And I found that a lot of the people talking most sense, to my great surprise, were were actually right-wing commentators. And then, as I've written a Substack article about called Resistance and Faith, many of those figures also turned out to be Christian. Very, very interesting observation to me. So I think that because democracy is breaking down and is under attack, and because party politics is becoming increasingly theatrical, increasingly a distraction, it's not actually that helpful anymore to talk about left versus right. The real battle here is kind of up versus down. It's a revolution from above, which the powers that be are trying to institute. They call it the Great Reset. Essentially, it's an attempt to remake the whole of society, politics, economics, etc., from the top down to suit the interests of the ruling class. If they are successful in that, I contend that the result will be a biodigital slavery system, a global technocracy. And then, therefore, what is required to stop that, in my view, is a social revolution, a revolution from below, to overthrow this deep state power structure that is seeking to oppress us. Now, to come to your second question about, is there a diagram of the resistance? I kind of wish they were. And one of the problems that we face is what I call the three camps of awareness. This all has to do with perception management. So very briefly, camp one is mainstream narratives and all of the things that politicians and the media try to persuade us of, typically full of lies, indeed big lies. But nevertheless, most of the population swallows the lies because they've been heavily propagandized and indoctrinated for their entire lives. Camp two is for those who have doubts about camp one. They realize that there's something very badly wrong. So, maybe you realize that it's impossible for two planes to destroy 3 towers on 9/11, or you realize that there's something really badly off about the lockdowns, and you start asking some critical questions, and you actually leave camp one, which is a difficult thing to do because it requires you to jettison a whole host of assumptions that you've developed over the course of your life about the strength of liberal democracy and the inherent virtue of Western civilization and all of these kind of things. But if you make it into camp two, there you are met, in my opinion, by a battalion of fake dissidents and fake heroes who have been placed there to win your trust and ultimately mislead you or take you down avenues which won't lead anywhere useful in terms of resistance. These actors are typically identifiable by the fact that they've not been banned from, say, YouTube and Facebook. They have very large followings, and there are certain topics that they will refuse to address. And finally, camp three is the truth, and it's a very hard place to get to because you've got to get out of camp two and into camp three, and it's also a very ugly place to be. Because when you see how power is really working in the world, it's very frightening and psychologically very difficult to accept. So there are various barriers for people getting there. And of course, particularly online, algorithms can be used to manipulate perception so that those in camp one are only really exposed to the mainstream ideas and they stay in camp one. Those in camp two are mostly exposed to the camp two ideas and they stay in camp two. Those in camp three, they have their voices throttled. They don't have major platforms. They have very low numbers of followers. They have what Linda Yaccarino calls freedom of speech, but not reach. So it's very difficult to get to. So if we're trying to map what the resistance looks like, it's really, really tricky because we never quite know for sure who are the genuine good actors and who are not. We also know we don't know just generally among the public kind of how deep the levels of resistance run, how deep the skepticism goes. About a quarter of the UK population, according to official figures, refused to take a COVID-19 vaccine. numbers are probably higher once because the figures are all kind of massaged and manipulated when it comes to COVID. So there's probably a sizable minority of people who not only have their doubts but are unwilling to go along with a lot of this. But actually being able to say with any certainty, how many people there are, or who they are, or who to trust, it's actually very, very difficult.
Right. Well, at one level, though, the way the word gets out. I mean, I preferred when Elon was running this show on X himself over Linda Yaccarino, and I noticed from my own X followership went from 0 to 5,000 in like a few months, and then it's been like hovering around 6 or 7, in the meanwhile, and like over a year since then, and that's the Yaccarino era. So I do have the freedom of speech, but not of reach, and I've had like amazing people on, over and over again, including yourself, interesting people, and I used to get. I mean, every now and then I'll hit. I've had one episode that has like 1 million views, but most of them, they top out, much lower than they did in the Musk era. But I think that there's the way to get around this. I watched The Wizard of Oz like over and over and over again as a kid, because that there's only a few channels, and they played some things yearly at a certain time of year. So The Wizard of Oz is kind of a favorite of mine as a movie more than as a book. But in that case, the wizard obviously is not a wizard. But I think there's certain aspects to the way things are today. I mean, Klaus Schwab is not a wizard either, and whoever replaces him, and Soros, George, and then Alex, whatever. They're just people. They live and breathe and have digestive disorders or pneumonia or whatever, like anybody else. They get issues and so forth. They're just humans. There's no sense like glorifying them. But I think you're right to point out some of these institutions. But getting back to the Wizard of Oz analogy, I think the Wizard of Oz is able to run the place, and he does it behind the green curtain. And so, who is the man behind the great curtain? Everyone thinks he's the Great Oz, and he's got a megaphone, and technology is not like today, but his voice echoes through the place, and people all think that he can do something for them. So the supplicants come, the Tin Man, the Cowardly Lion, and the Scarecrow come, and they want something from him. Now, in this case, the wizard is benevolent. I think it's not Klaus Schwab. It's more like, say, Marcus Aurelius, as it turns out. A ruler, but a ruler with sympathy for the people, and he anoints them essentially by saying that they had, in their own personal quest, they had uncovered the attributes which they want. So he basically gives them knowledge. He gives them wisdom to recognize that at their own travails they have a lot of what they already need. Now, that's not to say Schwabian, you will have nothing and be happy. That's not quite the same thing, but we don't have that kind of leader. I'm wondering, can our institutions produce the leadership? Are we never going to get that? Why do we have our leaders, kind of so, what's the word? Have so much animosity to the people themselves? They want not just the Great Reset, but kind of, people doubt this, but the Great Replacement. Kind of replace the people who are there, who are semi-knowledgeable, with those, from, say, other third world places and whatnot, to use that term, might have less, respect and knowledge of their own place. It seems to me like a kind of a self-preservation aspect where the leadership is insecure about themselves, and they have to kind of keep changing and morphing in order to maintain a power structure. I don't know if you find anything there you want to pick over.
Yeah. So in my COVID book, I'm quite damning of the entire political class over the lockdowns and the coerced injections and so on. In the UK, for example, Parliament repeatedly voted in favour of renewing the Coronavirus Acts, which is one of the most draconian pieces of legislation that's ever been passed in this country. There was no real resistance at all among the political class to these measures, which were demonstrably harmful. And furthermore, the UK government knew that they would be harmful. It published a report in July 2020 saying that in terms of the quality adjusted life years lost because of the lockdowns, it would be worse to lock down than not to lock down. And nevertheless, it locked down anyway and kept the country in an almost continual state of lockdown until July 2021. So, in my opinion, the political class has an awful lot to answer for. Now, does that mean that the book stops with the political class? No, because as I've already said, politicians are mere implementers of policies that are formulated at higher levels. And it seems to me that politicians must be bullied, bribed, blackmailed, or otherwise coerced, maybe brainwashed, in order to en masse sign off on so many of these policies. I actually put that question to Andrew Bridgen a few weeks ago, and he agreed with me. British MP, former British MP, just lost his seat. So there's a real there's a real problem there with the with our politicians. But what we need to understand is, you ask why are they so hostile to us? The migration aspect you describe, I regard as just one of many aspects of the Omni War. In this country, net migration to the UK has remained within a broad spectrum of between 170,000 and 330,000 people between 1994 and 2022. It never really went out of that range. And then all of a sudden, in Q3 of 2022, it spikes significantly higher and heads all of the way up in excess of 700,000. And furthermore, while previously most of the net migration had been EU, from the EU net migration, during this extraordinary spike, virtually all of it is non-EU. So all of a sudden, there's been this huge kind of shift in terms of migration into immigration into the UK, where very large numbers of non-EU citizens are now residents here in the UK, and similar things are going on all around the world, of course. So again, the transnational aspect to me signals that this is non-accidental. It's part of a wider nefarious agenda. Yeah, thank you very much. So there we go. That's close to the 700,000 figure that I mentioned. It did top 700,000 at one stage, but you can see there how significant that spike is in 2022, 2023, and still continuing. So yeah, so the hostility. I mean, it's a war, as I say, and the only way of properly understanding this war is in terms of global class relations. It's a war being waged by the transnational ruling class, the ruling classes of all countries, fundamentally in cooperation, in order to be able to maintain their rule and maintain their position at a time when the existing control system has largely gone into crisis now. So I argue this in chapter 1 of the COVID book. Mark Carney, for example, was addressing some of the most powerful figures in international finance at Jackson Hole, Wyoming in August 2019, and openly stating that the existing international monetary and financial system was about finished. That was the same month at which BlackRock started getting going on what John Titus has called its going direct reset, in refashioning the whole monetary system. In 2019, we saw major social protests in 35 different countries. That's 1 in 5 countries. So major unrest all around the world after a decade or more of austerity and 4 decades of neoliberalism, seeing the wealth distributed in an ever more unequal manner, accruing ever more to the top 1% and the top 0.1% and the top 0.001% and so on. So it's produced a terminally kind of lopsided oligarchic capitalism, to quote Kees van der Pijl, Dutch scholar. And the propaganda system also failing, after 2 decades of independent media and citizen journalism and so on, and more people seeing through the lies. So all of these control mechanisms, which have been in place for decades and were sufficient to manage the population, really were failing in 2019. And that's why this COVID operation got going in 2020. They had to make the move for the sake of self-preservation. So on the one hand, they've been preparing for this for decades. When I say they, I'm talking about the ruling class here. On the other hand, I still sense it may have come a little bit earlier than they would have liked, because there was also quite a lot that was kind of botched about that COVID operation. They've played their hand in a major way. A lot of people who would otherwise have stayed asleep, in inverted commas, are now waking up in ever faster numbers. And of course, once awake, you stay awake. So there's an awful lot happening at this moment in history.
Yes, I agree. I was reading through your book, and I had a couple of quotes that when you talk about 2019 being this year of crisis, I personally don't remember it that way. I mean, economically, things were kind of, haven't been really better, in a few decades. The United States had, 3 years of Donald Trump, and whatever people may think of him, the economy was doing gangbusters. We had the lowest unemployment in decades. And one of my areas of interest, the narcotic opioid epidemic, had gone down. The numbers of deaths had gone down. And this is like one of the great unspoken things. Our media makes sins of commission, and they make sins of omission. One of the, whenever something happens well under Trump, they don't mention it. And this kind of, if you don't hear about the opioid epidemic, that means it's getting better. And so it did, because there were more blue collar jobs. I don't really want to go down that vein too much, but I wrote about it in Brownstone on the methadone article about the origins of the opioid epidemic. So 2019 was a good year, and I pulled some quotes from your book. We can maybe go over some of these. The COVID-19 book, not the more recent book, but let me just read from them. I could put them up, I guess. Sorry. So the COVID-19 operation, proximate triggers by 19. Okay, for the one I'm going to get to first is, I guess, the acute crisis of capitalism in 2019. I was puzzled over that a little bit, so maybe you can talk on that. But while you're doing so, maybe this can be incorporated. This is a quote from your book: the COVID-19 operation, proximate triggers, and you have them capitalized, so I assume that's a name. Now, by 1968 at the latest, the logic of an increasingly transnational class struggle meant that the ultimate outcome would either be a global dictatorship, the fulfillment of a permanent revolution, or world socialism, requiring the expropriation of the means of production, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm just wondering, are those the only two choices? And what does it all mean? And what was the acute crisis of capitalism per se? If it was, when things got so much worse during COVID-19, the following year and years, wouldn't we have seen, a greater collapse if things were collapsing in 2019? And then we had this kind of body blow to the world economy in the subsequent years.
Right. So when we're dealing with capitalism, it's not just an economic system. Capitalism is also a social system, and it's about class relations. And it's a system which permits the ruling class to maintain its domination over the working and lower and middle classes. So it's important to understand it in that way. So we go beyond just economics and GDP figures or whatever. So the acute crisis is really evident through the social protests, when it becomes very, very clear worldwide that people are getting pretty sick and tired of existing arrangements. So, for example, if you look at real income, i.e. Adjusted for inflation in the United States, for most of society, it hasn't risen barely at all since the 1960s, nor has the minimum wage. Nevertheless, massive amounts of wealth have been generated. So where is all of that wealth going? Now, in chapter 1 of the book, I cite the World Inequality Report from 2022, produced by three French academics, including the well-known Thomas Piketty. And what it shows is that worldwide, 76% of the world's wealth is controlled by only 10% of the world's population. The bottom 50, the poorest 50% of the world's population, so that's half of humanity, controls only 2% of the world's wealth. And in the last 25 years, the report notes, of all of the additional wealth that has been created globally, 38% of that has accrued to the top 1%. And then when you look within the top 1%, it accrues mostly to the top 0.1%, 0.01%, and so on. So there's a kind of almost exponential curve towards the end. So the acute crisis comes when you have a system which is so lopsided in that manner, and when significant protests begin, which were also starting to assume a socially progressive form as well, not like the kind of populist movements of previous years, but some much more socially progressive kinds of protests in places like India and Chile and so on. So this was obviously seen as a major threat by the ruling class, and I think that was one of the key reasons why they took the decision that they did to shut everything down in 2020. And all of those worldwide protests, of course, went away. And what did we have instead? The lockdowns. And just quickly to come back to your Wizard of Oz analogy, the lockdowns were kind of in and of themselves a psychological operation to, at one level, conjure a kind of illusion of omnipotence. Wow, look at the powerful forces that we're dealing with here. They can just shut down the entire world just like that, and place half of humanity under house arrest and so on. But as you quite rightly say, it is like the wizard behind the curtain here. They don't want you to see how few of them there are. They don't want you to be able to piece together the class relations at work here. Instead, everyone, the aim is to keep everybody psychologically deceived, confused, in a state of fear and stress and so on, so that the public doesn't realize what's fundamentally going on. But that, I think, is the bigger picture that we need to see here.
Well, thank you for that. I'm not a Piketty fan. I'm more of a Thomas Sowell fan, and he talks about income inequality, and we're not going to have time to do him justice per se. But that's a static. It's kind of like taking a picture of a horse, while he's in a race, and you have that picture when he's not touching the ground. You just take that photograph. You say, "Oh my God, horses fly." It's a misapprehension to do that. There's a manner of flux. I venture to say older than you. I'm actually willing to stand by that. And I remember a time when the world had far more poverty overall, and there's been there's an old example that what would you choose just for simple lifestyle, leaving aside power? What would you rather be, like impoverished in New York City in 2018, or the Queen, the King of England in 1652? No toilets, no central heating, blah blah blah. All the creature comforts that we have, amongst the poor. The major problem in poverty in the United States is obesity. That used to be a problem exclusively of the wealthy, to have too much food. So I think what's missing out in this equality, obsessing over that. And I'm not saying you're wrong that people don't obsess over it, but I think it's a false false indicator, a misplaced. It's cat following the laser beam. It's a diversion, I guess. And really, you should be looking at how people and countries have done. And until 2020, they were all getting better. Life expectancy in Ghana was going up. I'm just using that as a placeholder. But all the indices of wealth were happening, throughout the economic sphere. And so people again, the situation is desperate as usual. Things are never perfect, but I think things there have been huge strides in the general level of capability in impoverished places. And I just want to kind of push back on one thing about the capitalism. Always, I think capitalism, first of all, it started as a pejorative, intended so by Karl Marx. I mean, the actual system is free market, exchange and so forth. And that's kind of what we need for ideas, obviously. Not the true answer doesn't get out unless there's a free market of ideas and exchange. And I think, X currently is that. There could be others, but that is where it happens, and that is how we mutually benefit. I've learned a lot just by sitting next to you, transnationally, across the ocean simultaneously, amazingly enough. And that is obviously a Zoom call, whatever, all these kind of things that happen, via capitalism. It happened through free market. If you look at the satellite picture of North and South Korea at night, you see that one idea works and the other one doesn't. Not to say everyone's happy in South Korea and capitalism always works and so forth, but it's clearly better than the alternative. And so, what you come down with is I would kind of push back that capitalism is those other things. I think people do those other things, but free marketism per se is just that. It's like if you're on X and you're having an argument, doesn't mean you're right, doesn't mean you win the argument, doesn't mean you come away happy, but you probably come away more edified than if you hadn't had it. And so I think that's all we can ever expect. At base, we're just a few branches away from primates and lemurs and lemurs and whatnot, and who don't have any of this stuff. So we have our miseries, we have our world wars and so forth, but we don't kind of live out in the cold the way rodents do, and have to deal with life such as raccoons and so forth. So the things can be bad, but they can also be good. Anyway, so we're kind of rounding out the hour, and I'd like to give people an opportunity to look at your Substack and so forth. And I'd like to get a sense of kind of your thoughts and advice for people listening.
Well, thanks for highlighting the Substack. I think you're right that inequality is only one aspect of the picture, and I think fundamentally when we're dealing in terms of class relations and the kind of control mechanisms at play, we can kind of bracket the kind of differences that we probably have between kind of free markets and kind of other interpretations of capitalism. But when you look, for example, at demonstrable projects initiated by BlackRock with the support of the central banks to refashion the international monetary and financial system, this is on a scale that hasn't been witnessed since the Bretton Woods arrangements of 1944, and the IMF chief Kristalina Georgieva actually likened what was taking place in 2020 to that Bretton Woods moment. So we can see, even from the pronouncements of these kind of key figures from their own mouths, that they see it that way, that there is a fundamental transformation now in play that they have initiated that is of the scale that you normally would only see through World War. So yeah, I think that's worth really keeping in mind. Sorry, what was your other question?
My other question is, what's your favorite sport? No, do you have a favorite sport?
Soccer. Not to play, but to watch. I'm quite a keen soccer fan.
Yeah, no, I don't remember my other question, so I'm going to have to.
No problem.
But I want people to see your Substack, so I'm going to put it up here.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So here we go.
Here you have the symposium.
That's right. Yes, that's pinned for the time being to advertise that. So we're hoping for quite a high viewership on this. It's going to be streamed across, I'm told, 15 to 30 channels or so. So the format of the event will be, we'll have 4 speakers, beginning with me, then Patrick Wood, then Alyssa Johnson, then Dan Brody. We'll each speak for 45 minutes with short gaps between the presentations. And we'll round it off with a round table event. Catherine Austin Fitz is moderating the event, and she'll also participate in the round table. So please join us for that, or if you can't, it's going to go up online afterwards in any case. Yes, and then across the rest of the Substack, you can see all of the different kind of things that I'm interested in across the top, from transhumanism and 9/11 to COVID and much else besides. And so I'm publishing All kinds of material on there for paid subscribers, snippets of volume 2 of the COVID book as I'm writing them. There's plenty of videos on there, plenty of interviews. Today I've just put up a presentation, a keynote presentation that I was invited to make for the Targeted Action Conference last month. So there's all kinds of material on there. Most of it's for free. But I would encourage particularly readers of the COVID-19 Volume 1 book, which I was able to get open access funding for that book, all of which went to the publisher. But what it means is that there it is. It's available for free to anybody to download and redistribute under a Creative Commons 4.0 license. So a lot of hard work went into that book. If you do download it, please do share it. I'd really appreciate that. But if you do find something of value in it, please also consider giving something back, particularly now that my academic career is over. I'm increasingly reliant on public support. So a paid Substack subscription is helpful to me. buymeacoffee.com/DA Hughes. Or I'm just setting up a website at the moment, not much on there, but davidahughes.net. And there's a support tab there with a range of other options as well. So if you can help me keep doing this kind of work for as long as possible, please do. And I'll be extremely grateful for your support.
Well, thank you very much, David. I end with my own little commercial here. If you want to help support my podcast, you can buy this book. That'll put a few coins in my coffer. It'll be even better if you read it, even better if you buy it and read it. Pass it around, and buy it, read it, pass it around, and give a great review. This is something that had people known about at the time, that Zika is a real dengue virus, and microcephaly is a real but unfortunate but very rare congenital abnormality. And in 2015/16 Brazil, this became a pandemic, as it were. But it was a pandemic of mistakes. It was really a panic and a misinterpretation, bad science, and it didn't go through peer-reviewed journals. A little bit of ego involved, and it got taken up by other forces. My term of art is conspiracy of interest. So I'm not a conspiracist. I'm not a conspiracy theory. I don't think people ahead of time. Oh, well, actually, I take that back. I'm sorry to bore you, but there was a slight conspiracy regarding Zika microcephaly. So. There was a group of scientists in northeast Brazil, which is poorer, hotter, darker skin, so forth, than southern Brazil. So it's kind of upside down from the United States, and maybe similar to the UK. The north is poorer, and they formed a group called CHIK-V, the mission, and it's named after chikungunya virus, and they just abbreviate it because chikungunya, and they call it CHIK-V. I like Chick-fil-A, but CHIK-V, the mission. The mission was named after the 1986 movie with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons, where the good guys are basically the Jesuits who were backing up the Guarani Indians in, I think, Paraguay or something like that, in the colonial era before it was Paraguay, and the bad people, obviously, the European colonials and so forth. And they formed this group to bring a virus to northeast Brazil. So they wanted chikungunya, which had never been there, to show up so they could get money and attention to northeast Brazil and have, a kerfuffle or whatever, and then people would focus on the area and start pouring money and research, all that kind of stuff. So chikungunya, the virus, didn't cooperate, but I think there was a little bit of bait and switch, and there was dengue and Zika are almost the same thing. There's 4 dengues that are named 1, 2, 3, and 4, conveniently enough, and Zika is not called dengue 5, but really could be, and had never appeared in the Americas, and somebody, I think, conflated some mild dengue cases with Zika. There were no Zika tests on Earth at the time. And anyway, so he announced it, and then it was sort of off to the races. He got a lot of fame and notoriety. He parlayed that into a better professorship in Argentina, Buenos Aires. And then a few months later, somebody said, oh, well, there's a few cases extra, usually about 7 cases of microcephaly at a time in a city of 2.5 million people, Recife, northeast Brazil, spelled Recife. And there were probably about 13. So it wasn't a big pandemic by any means. It was from going from 7 cases to 13, and so they had a bad criterion. They didn't really have a standard for measuring microcephaly because it's so rare. And so somebody from part 1 happened to live in part 2 and said, oh, that's new and that's new. That must cause that. And so since I'm on a riff, I'll just finish this up. So he, as a scientist, he called only the moms of microcephalic babies. He didn't do any comparison. And he called up 32 of them, and he or one of his assistants said, did you have any rash, chills, or fever back when you were pregnant last year? And so 25, 30, whatever. A lot of them said yes, because, I mean, it's the tropics. Fever, anyway. So he had fever, rash, and chill. So if anybody who said yes, he said, oh, that was Zika. Therefore, the baby with microcephaly was from Zika. And then he announced that without any peer-reviewed studies and so on, and became a panic. And it kind of took over. So as far as there was a conspiracy, there wasn't a conspiracy per se for Zika microcephaly, but once it was there, it kind of took over the airwaves because, believe it or not, and my feeling, ghoulishly, people wanted it to be the case so they could have emergency abortions. And abortions are illegal in Brazil and a few of the other conjoining Latin American countries. So it's kind of in ground zero for the NGOs that are promoting pro-abortion. And it was off to the races. So there were injunctions up to the Supreme Court and all that kind of stuff in Brazil. We hear a lot about the Supreme Court of Brazil now with Elon Musk and so forth. But anyway, that didn't quite succeed, but it got fanned by the left-leaning media as a way of bringing on abortion. And then the embattled president who was impeached, Dilma Rousseff, again spelled Rousseff, she brought the troops out and she rallied around Zika microcephaly as a national cause. So she could consolidate and entrench and so forth, and people would like her for having beaten back this thing. It didn't quite work for her. Anyway, it has been a lot of ramifications. People don't hear much about it, but there are ramifications all throughout Brazil. There's kind of a declining birth rate because people, lived in fear. They were told not to have any kids by a lot of the WHO aligned physicians in the area. So certain countries were given the dictate not to have children. Jamaica, Honduras, states within Brazil were told not to have any children until there was a Zika vaccine. Well, guess what? It's like almost a decade later, no vaccine. There would be no children in Brazil currently if anybody had listened. So, as far as the dictates go, fortunately, people don't always pay attention to them. And it seems to be kind of inversely proportional, fortunately, in a sense, to how much education people have. And a lot of the Western Europe places, have the highest levels of education, and they fell for a lot of the stuff that happened, with global warming and getting rid of nitrogen in the soil and all kinds of stuff that's happening to get rid of farmers. It's very kind of fanciful stuff. Fortunately, I think the people who are actually a little bit hungrier, literally and figuratively, tend to listen to these things less. So, one of the leading lights of, I again, apologize for my riff here, but one of the leading lights of COVID, in my view, was the erstwhile president of Tanzania, who said, kind of the hell with this. We're not doing this. We have other bigger problems. We're not worrying about this stuff. And plus, I think he actually could, said COVID-19 was, there's no viruses, it's just the devil, whatever. So I'm not I'm not on board with everything he said, but the end result was they didn't do anything. They didn't shut down. Nobody died. And along the Sweden, a lot of other places, they kind of present a counterexample. So my little silver lining on some of these clouds is that, people are not the elites, and people sometimes have a better sense. Hopefully, common sense will be a positive genetic trait we were able to carry through.
Yeah, brilliant. I'm no Zika expert, but the one thing that does come through to me there from your comments is that these epidemics and pandemics, they never seem to be quite what the public is told.
Yeah.
There always seems to be something else going on, doesn't there?
Yeah. Well, I wish a pox upon their houses, and preferably a monkeypox. Anyway,
very good.
So we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much for being on, David. I appreciate it. I hope this will be the first of many meetings, and maybe I'll see you at one of the Brownstone events.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me.